Welcome back. Today we're going to do something a little bit differently, and that is what I want to call a news blitz. Because there were several news stories that came out recently I wanted to talk about, but none of them I felt were large enough to warrant me making a video specifically about it, I have three here I'm just kind of throwing together that I'm going to talk about in this video. We're going to first start with Brett Kavanaugh. There was a new accusation against him by the New York Times and how entirely ridiculous it is and how they completely botched that story. We're also going to talk about AOC and how she continues to make the claim that climate change is going to destroy the world fairly quickly, and Miami specifically this time. And then we're going to talk about Planned Parenthood and an instance of how we know that Planned Parenthood is not the woman-loving organization that it claims to be, because they are essentially stripping a woman of her health care and her severance because they don't like what she's saying about them. So let's just jump right in with Brett Kavanaugh. So we probably all remember the really heated debate and confirmation hearing that was Brett Kavanaugh's hearing about a year ago. So I don't want to get into this too much, but recently there was an article by the New York Times, and the two authors of this article were essentially writing things that they had found out in a book where they investigated some of these accusations against Kavanaugh. Most of the article features experiences from Deborah Ramirez, who is the one that said that Brett Kavanaugh essentially exposed himself to her at a Yale party, but it took her something like 6 days talking to friends and lawyers and thinking about her memory before she could come forward and say that it was in fact Brett Kavanaugh. So one thing I want to point out here is that should be a fairly large red flag, because your memory is very, very susceptible to manipulation, even by yourself. As an example of that, when I was a kid, I watched Jurassic Park and I thought it was a great movie. But during one of them, my brothers, who are complete jerks to me, somehow convinced me that I had either blinked or fallen asleep and missed a scene where the T-Rex was on top of a mountain and just, doing his roar. And to this day, I can still see that image and that vision in my head. I convinced myself that I'd actually seen that part of the movie because I didn't want to feel left out and didn't want to be excluded. Later, they then said that it actually never happened, but I still have that memory in my mind. This is not to say that it discounts everything about Ramirez's story, but it is to say that your memory, again, can be manipulated. So it's important to look at other corroborating facts, of which there aren't a ton in most of these accusations. So what I want to do is look at the news story that they found during this investigation and talk about how the New York Times really did a horrible job with this. So we're reading right here. It says that they also uncovered another story. It says a classmate, Max Steyer, saw Mr. Kavanaugh with his pants down at a different drunken dorm party, where friends pushed his penis into the hand of a female student. Mr. Steyer, blah, 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 talks about him. And then I want to stop here. First off, apparently at Yale parties, people are just walking around naked, so that's kind of awkward. But the important part of this story is that after describing who Max Steyer was, that's where the article stopped. So it didn't have any more about this story specifically. And it's important because now it points out that the woman in question, according to her friends, does not remember the incident whatsoever. And it's included here, but if you scroll down at the end, you find the editor's note showing the fact that it did not include what I think is a very important piece of information. If someone makes an accusation and then the person who is part of that accusation is the victim says they don't remember it ever happening, that's a big piece of evidence to leave out. Obviously, again, it doesn't mean that it never happened, but that's something you should certainly bring up when you're talking about that accusation, and they failed to do so here. Now, to be fair to the authors of this article, they claim that they did originally include that line and it was then taken out. This is what they said.
The article, did it include those words that have since been added to the article?
It did.
It did. So somewhere in the editing process, those words were
Yeah,
changed.
I mean, I think what happened actually was that, we had her name, and the Times doesn't usually include the name of the victim. And so I think in this case, the editors felt like maybe it was probably better to remove it. And in removing her name, they removed the other reference to the fact that she didn't remember it.
So obviously they could be lying to save their own skin, but knowing what we know about the New York Times and how they are certainly biased in the way that they report their stories, I think it's safe to assume that someone did remove it, either because they thought it was attached to who the individual was too personally, or just because it made the story look better. Because let's be honest, it wouldn't be the first time the New York Times did something like this. So again, I'm not commenting too much on the veracity of the story. I'm just saying that that's a really, really big piece of information to purposefully omit from this story. Now moving to the next story, we have AOC and how She is still talking about climate change, how it's going to, end the world. Specifically this time, though, Miami. So here's what she had to say.
Because what's not realistic is Miami not existing in a few years. That's not realistic. So we need to be realistic about the problem.
Now, one thing that I think is important is that she actually hit on something that was true in that really weird climate change tirade. And she said that it's not realistic, Miami not existing in a few years. So she is correct that it is not realistic that Miami will not exist, meaning it will certainly exist, even though that's not the point that she was trying to get across. So here she seems to be claiming that in a few years, Miami will no longer exist because of climate change. First off, let's appreciate the fact that she is moving up her timeline. That earlier we had 12 years to combat climate change or else the world was going to end. And she said that multiple times. And now Miami only has a few years. So the timeline is getting changed here. But let's look at that. According to the IPCC report, which is generally accepted as the most notable and most knowledgeable organization about climate change and how it will affect the world from here on out, they found that the worst case scenario by the end of the century, which probably will not happen, you find that the sea level will rise by about 0.21 to 0.83 meters. And again, this is the IPCC that came out just this year. If we look at another article, it talks about if we don't limit our warming to below 4 degrees Celsius, that we can see an increase of about 0.5 to 1 meter. And for those of us who use feet, because we're weird like that, that equates to about 3 feet. So apparently, according to AOC, the 3 feet rise in sea level, again, by the end of the century, is somehow going to be responsible for Miami no longer existing in a few years. Now, perhaps she's trying to bring in things like hurricanes and other extreme weather conditions, but those things are not going to vary that dramatically over the next few years. Even the IPCC report does not make that claim. So once again, she's just fear-mongering to try and pass what she wants as legislation, which, looking back at the Green New Deal, was so ridiculous that no one in the Senate voted for it. And it was literally just a cash grab and a wealth redistribution in the form or in the guise of some climate change resolution. So if you want to truly address climate change and stop the stuff that you think is going to happen, then how about you propose things that are actually logical and realistic? Before we move on to the last story, if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe so you can always stay informed and get these sources I'm providing down below. Hit the notification bell as well so you can actually be informed when I have new videos. But also, if you have a BitChute, then go ahead and find me on there. I have a link down below in the description. You can check it out. And I'm trying to grow on BitChute at the same time as YouTube because YouTube is putting me in restricted mode and it's kind of hurting my growth. So I'm working on BitChute as well as YouTube. So check me out there too. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is about Planned Parenthood. Now, a few months ago, the president of Planned Parenthood, or former president, Leanna Wen, was fired. And in a video I talked about this, but according to her, she was fired because she was not focusing enough on abortion. But Planned Parenthood wanted to focus on abortions. And so because of that disconnect, she was fired. But now what's happening is that they are essentially trying to force her to sign a gag order or buy her silence. So this is what she wrote. I'm just going to read it. And it says, the board exercised its right to terminate my employment without cause, which requires them to pay severance and cover my family's health insurance. So here she's saying they could fire me and that is acceptable, that's within their right. But then she says, now they refuse to honor my employment contract unless I agree to a gag clause. So what that means is that Planned Parenthood is basically saying you need to stop talking about this, you need to shut up, or else we will not honor our side of the contract. And their side of the contract included severance payments as well as health insurance and healthcare. So what's essentially happening here is Planned Parenthood is stripping away a woman's healthcare and health insurance because she is disagreeing with them and publicly speaking negatively about their organization. Now, I don't know about you, but I have heard time and time again that Planned Parenthood really cares about all women. They just want them to be healthy and have the healthcare that they need. If that is the case, then why are they removing healthcare and the severance payment to this person who is a woman? That completely goes against everything they claim. So again, it shows once more that Planned Parenthood actually cares more about the 300,000 abortions they do every year than about the other aspects of their organization. So Planned Parenthood, regardless how you feel about abortions, is just not a very good organization. If you're threatening to not honor your contract because someone's talking negatively about you, you are not a good organization. So that's all that I had for this video. And I'd like to get some feedback on if you like the format of this being all in one video rather than 3 smaller videos. Because again, I didn't really feel like these things were worthy enough to talk about for an extended period of time, so I just kind of threw them together. And what do you think about these stories? Have you heard about them? Did they change any of your mind if you learn a little bit more about it? And just overall, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Be sure to check out one of these other videos you may have missed before you take off, and I will be sure to see you next time.